Yep.
Perfect. Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar on unlocking success in practice with our presenter Danny Hayden. He's a principal and chair advisor of Brett-Knowles Health from Chartered Accountants and Advisors. Today is funded by country SAPHN, and I'd like to formally hand this over to Danny. Thank you, Danny. Nice to have you tonight, and then we look forward to your presentation.
Great, thank you very much for that, and welcome everyone. I hope you've managed to finish up your days and your consulting, and appreciate that for some of you it's a challenge getting here and committing this time. So hopefully you'll get some value out of this. Tonight we're looking at unlocking success in practice and really looking at the key issues around sustainability for running a practice. And as most of you know, that in recent times, it's become more and more challenging to run a practice with increasing costs. I guess the challenges of just getting your workforce, GP workforce, plus also other staff, and more recently that whole issue of payroll tax that has been a concern for a lot of practices. So just to provide some background through my work, I've worked with Brett-Knowles SA as part of their firm as a practice management consultant, and I work with quite a few rural practices. Some of you might know that I've done quite a bit of work with Clare Medical Centre over the years, but I've also had affiliation through our work with quite a few rural practices. So I'm conscious and aware of the issues that are faced in rural South Australia. Tonight, just before we go on, the key 4 topics that I'm going to cover over, we've got about 2 hours sort of set aside, and we'll look at about half an hour for each of these. These key topics include governance and the issues around governance and what does that mean in a GP practice. Finance and financial management, and what does it mean to plan for success? Then a key issue about people and looking at supportive and collaborative workplace. So how do you get your people working to the top of their game? And finally, talking about a crucial issue for many practices is managing succession. So before we go into the detail too much, I'll just hand over to Vasala and just ask her to do the acknowledgement of country.
Perfect. So I'll start off with, we acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where we work and live. We pay our respects to them, past, present, and emerging. We celebrate the stories, culture, and traditions of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders of all communities and who also work and live on this land. And back to you, Danny. Thank you.
Great, thank you for that. So today, as I go through each of these key topics, I'm going to share with you some key areas that I think for you to be able to understand and to work through. Some of the main points that I want to make. I'll try and share those with you quite quickly, and then break for a bit of time to invite questions and to hopefully we can have some chat and dialogue about each of those areas. So bear with me as we go through that. I hope that format's going to work for you to allow you to have some questions as we go through. There's always a disclaimer, and this information is general in nature, and we encourage you to talk to your advisors about any particular details. Let's move on from that. This is just an infomercial about Brett-Knowles, and we're an accounting advisory firm, but the main thing to say is that We work in the health space, so we've got a Brentnall's Health arm as a service. And as I said before, I'm a practice management consultant. And so when we work with our practices, and I work with practices that don't have their accounting done by Brentnall's. We work with quite a range of practices. The areas that we like to focus on are set out in this diagram. We want to look at business planning. Is the practice planning for success? We need to look at the financial performance of the practice. And finally, the third component is practice operations. Is the practice running efficiently and effectively? So that's really the model that we work through. But for tonight, the first topic I want to jump into is around good governance. When I have the opportunity through my work to work with high-performing practices, but I also have the opportunity to go into many practices and review them as a practice assessment, to look deeply into the business as to how it's operating and to provide them with a report for what could be improved. And I guess one of the things that I've found over the years with those practice assessments is that one of the cornerstone areas that practices have often neglected over time and is crucial for the practice to actually achieve the goals that it wants to achieve is around good governance. How is the practice governed? How are decisions made within that practice? So I'll talk to you about what does that mean within a practice. So this slide just shows you, I guess in theory, what governance is. And governance really comes down to the process of decision making. How are decisions made in your practice? Who makes those decisions? And how do you make sure they're implemented? And for a lot of practices, that can be a little bit chaotic in terms of how decisions are made. And sometimes decisions are made, but they never actually get implemented. Things just don't get done that should get done. So good governance actually requires applying some of the principles around this approach. This is an approach that's used with a lot of boards of management, but having in place, I guess, internal accountabilities, looking at monitoring and supervising and your policies and procedures, but also outward looking in terms of what is your strategy moving forward as a business. So some of the work that we have in terms of good governance is planning for the future and looking ahead. What does the future look like? But also focusing on what have you achieved along that journey and make sure you're monitoring the outcomes of what you're achieving. So that's just an overview of what governance is about. But let's look at it in practical terms. For a lot of practices, the first starting point we work with is actually understanding the structure. What is the organization structure and what are the lines of responsibility and accountability within your practice? And this is an example here of a reasonably large practice where it shows the different lines of accountability. So if you look at from reception to senior receptionist up through operations, through to their business manager, and then through to the principals. Your practice may not be that big. Your practice may have a practice manager and a receptionist and a nurse and not much more than that. But the same principles apply. Who is responsible, who answers to who, and where do they get their directions from? And that's really often what we see in practices is this is really mixed up and it's not clear. The other part on that chart that I've shown is the clinical governance component. So there's the part about running the practice, but there's also about the clinical decisions, the clinical structure that you work under, and who's ultimately responsible for those decisions. Often in a medical practice, that ultimate responsibility comes back to the principals deciding about how they want services delivered within their practice. One of the things I commonly find in practices, though, is that they might have a structure like this that's very clear about how decisions are made and the lines of accountability. But what we find sometimes is that somebody in that structure actually has an extraordinary amount of power that they shouldn't have, and may sabotage decisions that are made by the principals in that practice. And so these are key issues that sometimes we find practices struggling to deal with, to actually unwrap this and make sure that their decision-making structures are appropriate, managed well, and the integrity of those structures is maintained. The other thing I was going to highlight for you, and this framework shows it, is that in terms of governance of a practice, there are three key areas of governance. There's business governance, and that's often at the principal level, the owners of the business and maybe their practice manager looking at where is the business going? How is the business operating? How can we ensure the sustainability of that business moving forward? The next part is around clinical governance, and practices are commonly now putting in place doctors' meetings or clinical forums and that to engage their doctors in discussion around how do we provide the best care to our patients? How do we respond to the changes that government keep throwing to us in terms of service delivery? But having a clinical governance or a clinical forum to enable that to happen. And then the third part is the operational part. What is the part that maybe your practice manager is in charge of in terms of managing operations of your practice, how your admin staff are performing, how your nursing team works within your practice. And one of the common things I find with practices is that when they have a meeting with the principals, a lot of the focus is on either the clinical governance issues or the operational issues, but they never actually spend time focusing on the business governance side of things. What's the strategy of the business? How is the business performing? What are the priorities moving forward? Is the financial performance of the practice healthy? So my question to you is that how does your practice deal with separating out these three different layers of governance, and do you actually balance your attention on each of these areas? I wanted to also share with you about the concept of internal briefing papers. I've often sat with doctors in a meeting of the principals, and issues come up, they're talked about. They might talk about an issue for 20 minutes. It goes around in circles. There's a lot of discussion, a lot of good ideas and suggestions. And ultimately, after all of that discussion, no decisions are made. And that might sound a bit familiar to you in your practice, or you may actually have this managed well within your practice. But one of the things that I found that works really well for helping to make decisions is to use briefing papers. And briefing papers, the idea of them is they are brief, 2 to 3 pages at most, and they summarize the elements that I've got on this slide. So what they do is drill down very quickly to what are the key issues about this that need to be addressed. What's the financial impact? What are some of the solutions? Importantly, what are some of the risks with the decision that needs to be made? And then what are the recommendations? And I really encourage practice managers and business owners to use these briefing papers to get their thoughts sorted out, to put them down on paper to make sure that they actually will work. But also, really importantly, to back their judgment in terms of putting their recommendation on what needs to happen for that practice. So I've got a really good template with instructions for how to use a briefing paper. My email address is there. Please email me and ask for a copy of the briefing paper template, and I'll send that out to you. It's a really helpful resource. The other key thing that is often missing in general practices is clarity about who can make what decisions. And this tool, a delegations matrix, is something that's commonly used across businesses, not-for-profit organisations, etc., to articulate for every key decision in the business, who has the authority to make that decision, who do they need to consult with, and any other particular details around that. So this is a really useful tool to help get rid of some of the confusion about who should have or could have and does make the key decisions in your practice. And it's a great exercise to actually work through all of those decisions to actually identify who has that responsibility and have you got the right people making the right decisions in your practice. So just to round off the good governance component for you at the moment, this is a checklist that you can use. And sorry, I forgot to mention before that these slides will be made available for you, so you don't need to be scribbling down or taking photos of all of this. I'll freely make this available to you. But this is a great checklist to think about what have you got in place for good governance in your practice. So these things are really important. Do you have a strategic plan? Clarity about where the business is going? Do you have core values about what's important to your business? Your organization chart, clear roles and responsibilities, structures in place for separating out the strategic and the operational matters, delegations of authority. Do you have a declaration of interest register? Do you know what interests other partners have in other areas of, especially in the health sector? Your policies and procedures, terms of references, all of that in there, plus your approach to quality improvement and the systems that you have in place for identifying risk. So all of those things add up to good governance. And the last part there is a grievance procedures. So that is a quick snapshot of some really key points around good governance in practice, and also some hints and suggestions to you for some things to think about in terms of how does your practice manage its governance in place. So I'll just take a break there and have a breath, but also see, have we got any questions that have come up from you? I'm happy to take those questions, and I think we might have a couple in the chat room. So
no questions as of yet,
okay.
but is there anybody that wants to ask any questions at all? You're welcome to put it through the chat function, or I'm more than happy to allow you to talk for this webinar. So I'll just do that quickly for everybody.
Yeah, if we open up the mic,
Yeah, we'll open up the mic, so that'd be better for everyone. Let's see. Perfect. Just going through everyone's names. Done. So anybody that has any questions, please unmute your mic. You are now able to talk. Just send your questions through if you'd like. Thank you.
And happy if anyone has any comments. I'm interested in some of the challenges you might have in your practice around governance and those matters that we've gone through. In some rural practices, there's also issues around governance where potentially if you're working out of a hospital environment and or in partnership in some way, where the hospital might have its own sort of governance protocols and things that you have to work in. So that can also be challenging in terms of that interface between your private practice and then a SA Health type facility as well. All right.
Are we all good to continue on?
Yeah, all good. So great. Well, just remember.
Sorry, Danny. There's one question.
Oh, okay.
Has come up. Interested in differences between larger and smaller practices. Unfortunately, we currently have a single doctor ownership.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, because when we deal with larger practices, there's a lot more complexity around the structures and the processes that they need to put in place. I think in a smaller practice, the principles still need to be applied in terms of how decisions are made, who answers to who, and also I guess things like your priorities and making sure that you are attending to the business elements as well as the clinical elements and the operational parts. So I'll give you an example. In a larger practice, they might have they'll often have the principals would meet around a business meeting, and so they would have a separate meeting to then potentially a practice meeting with a broader group of their doctors involved who are looking at the clinical parts. And then a lot of practices these days are moving towards having management committees or management groups with maybe a partner and then their managers on that to run the operational side of things. Whereas in a small practice like you mentioned, you might have a practice meeting that actually covers over all of those three areas just into one meeting with your whole team involved. And what I encourage smaller practices to do is to organize your agenda so that you attend to those important things, so that the minor operational things you don't spend too much time on those and don't actually get to the important business elements that you need to address within your practice. So I've been in quite a few practice meetings where a lot of time might have been talked about something that was really minor and operational, and you get towards the end of the meeting and the most important thing that they need to talk about, it gets rushed and we don't have enough time to do it. So just reorganize your agenda so that the most important things are at the top, and if the least important things you don't get to, they might fall to the floor, or you'll pick them up at your next meeting. Was that helpful at all in terms of that explanation?
Another question. Oh, it says thank you for that. Perfect. Thank you for the question, James.
The other thing to think about, and for smaller practices, one of the issues that's coming up is around your accreditation requirements and this whole thing about, do you have a business plan or a strategic plan and that. And I think it's important for every business to have a strategy. What is it? What are they looking to do? What are the key priorities for them to focus on? But our approach to strategic planning is not to try and create a 20-page plan with 50 different action items, etc. I think the important thing, especially the smaller your practice is, to actually drill down and focus on what are the 2 or 3 key things that you're going to do in the next 6 to 12 months. Get your team on board and make sure that you get those 2 or 3 things achieved. I think the challenge for a lot of businesses is that their focus is all over the place, and so they don't actually execute on implementing the high priority things that they need to implement because of all those different distractions. So just encourage you with your practice. A core part of your governance is to have a clear strategy so your whole team knows what they're working towards. Keep that strategy focused so that it's on the 2 to 3 things that are going to make the biggest impact for your business moving forward. And then the value add on top of that is then I would align your quality improvement activities that you need to do for your PIP payments and also for accreditation with those strategies. So you're actually not creating extra work for yourself. You're actually compounding the investment that you're making in terms of implementing those areas. All right. Any other questions around governance?
Great. I think that was the questions that we all had.
Great. All right. Well, I'll just remind you, it's an area that's it's not commonly attended to, and just something for your practice to think about, because there are opportunities to ensure the sustainability of her practice with good governance principles in place. Now, let's go talk about finance, money. So aside from providing high quality, good clinical services as being the core of general practice. A general practice does need to run as a financially successful business. And I wanted to start off by talking about budgeting. And this doesn't matter whether you're a small practice or a really large practice. We've often done presentations around financial performance and how to make and how to drive financial performance in practices. And when we survey the audience and ask the question, how many of your practices have a budget and work with a budget? I guess we would regularly see probably only 25% of the attendees put their hand up and say they're managing a budget. And some of these practices are multi-million-dollar practices. They're generating, you know, $1 to up to $10, $15 million, but they don't have a budget. And I think we would all know that in our personal lives, budgeting is actually quite important just to manage our own personal finances, and it's equally important in your practice. So one of the first starting places with any practice that we work with is to talk about, well, what's your budget? Are you forecasting for success? What are you forecasting to understand what your expenses are going to increase over the next 12 months so that you know how to manage your fee policy and your fee increases over the next 12 months. And this diagram that you've got there just shows you some reporting that we do for practices in terms of looking at what is their actual income year to date, what is the budget that they set, and then looking at the variances. And in the thing I like about these reports is that green is good and red is not. And so you can see quite clearly where the practice is ahead of budget and behind budget. And it's also important to compare with last year and see whether or not you're ahead or behind from last year. But the reality is that a lot of practices only ever compare their performance with last year. And if that's what their benchmark is, that's what they're going to get. And so budgeting is actually about forecasting what you want this year to look like and seeing whether you're able to get to that point. The other thing that we do with these reports is that we can then look at how the practice is performing from one month to the next. And you can see then, based on your budget, where is that practice likely to end up in terms of its end of year performance if the budget is achieved. So these types of reports, if you set up your budgets in MYOB or Xero, these types of reports can be extracted and automatically generated from the work that your bookkeeping people have done. That we use a program at Brentnall's called Fathom. We set up the reports and we can set them up in different ways for clients. So I would encourage you, if your accountant's not doing that for you, you can talk to your accountant about do they use a process that can give you these types of reports, Fathom or Spotlight Reporting, that type of program. And so the key message here is plan for success by budgeting for it, and then you've got a way throughout the year of actually monitoring about whether or not you're on track for achieving the financial goals that you've set. The next part that we look at with practices is around key performance indicators. And we've been talking for, I think, the last 20 years around monitoring key performance indicators. What are the key numbers that you need to monitor to check on the financial health and well-being of your practice? And this slide here shows you, I guess, my snippet of what the key numbers that I would look at in most practices I oversee. These are the key numbers that I want to know to see how the practice is operating and how healthy it is. This is using a program called Cubico, and some of you might be familiar with it. There are other programs that do this, but Cubico is probably one of the best from a point of view of being able to get this information easily. you can use it with both best practice and medical director. So just want to make clear, I haven't got an arrangement. Well, we've got an arrangement with Cubico where our clients get a discount. We don't get any kickbacks. So if I'm telling you Cubico is worth looking at, it's not because I get any kickbacks from that. I think it's worthwhile having because it means you're able to get this information without wasting a lot of time trying to create reports. So if you look at this, it's important to know how much revenue you're generating and how does that revenue compare with last year? What is your billing per consultation hour? And also how much are you billing per appointment that you bill? Looking at your bulk billing rates, how many patients you're seeing per hour, understanding what outstanding debt there is. A key piece of information is your chronic disease management billings as a percentage of total billings. And then looking at what chronic disease management revenue that you're getting in for your practice. So these are, from looking at these numbers, I can tell a lot about how well a practice is operating. So it's important for hopefully you to be tracking those key numbers. What I wanted to do here is then just to give you a look at some of the benchmarks. So if we look at a practice, revenue per attendance at the moment across Cubico's data is up to $97 per attendance, and revenue per hour up to about 400. Bulk billing rates across, and these practices are all across Australia. Bulk billing rate, and this is based on invoices, is 67%, and the D&A rate is 2.3%. That's actually gone down dramatically over time. The chronic disease management revenue at 10%. And a really important figure to monitor, which is in terms of your staffing and wondering whether you're overstaffed or understaffed, is your support staff, which is all of your admin, your practice manager, your nurses, all of your support staff as a percentage of your total revenue. And that should be around that 21 to 22% mark. And then we commonly see for practices that rental costs are around 5 to 6%, depending on the structures that they've got in place. So I've done some work with practices out of New South Wales, and we went into a whole lot of them and asked them some key questions about what are your numbers? What can you provide us with this basic financial information? And none of those practices, even the high-performing practices, couldn't provide us with this basic information about their practice. I would encourage you to at least know some of these key numbers to know how your practice is performing. I also wanted to talk about incentive payments because the reality is we find that with practices, we don't know any practice that actually generates a profit purely out of consulting income. They're all reliant on the practice incentive payments or workforce incentive payments as well. And some of them reliant on the revenue that they get through from pathology or other tenants. So they're important income streams. And the newest part of that is My Medicare. And in the industry at the moment, there's a discussion really about what is the future of those practice incentive payments and workforce incentive payments. And the reality is, from what I can see, is that there'll be more and more of that income is going to be pushed in through My Medicare. So My Medicare at the moment, the aged care incentive payment has commenced. From 1 November, there'll be changes with the chronic disease management and assessment items, which My Medicare will protect those items for patients who are registered My Medicare. There are also some PHNs across Australia, not in South Australia as far as I know, that are working with a program for hospital frequent flyers and looking at some bundled payments to enable practices to focus on those frequent flyer patients, so patients who are frequently admitted to hospital 10 or more times a year. So what's next? I just wanted to give you a bit of an insight into this. Here's my crystal ball. So from November, You would have hopefully heard that the team care arrangement 723 is going to be deleted from the Medicare schedule. And I don't think there's anybody who is sad to see that go. The whole team care arrangements and the red tape associated has been a bugbear for the industry for a long time. What they are offering to do at the same time is to say that a GP management plan review, your item 7, that should be 732. Hopefully you're aware that I've made a mistake there, 732. The rebate will match the GP management plan rebate. So essentially in the future, from 1 November, the practice will get the same amount for doing a GP management plan, a care plan, as they will get for doing a review. It will be an equalised amount. So whether you do a review or you do a new care plan is going to become a matter of semantics. The key issue for your practices is what is the value of the GP management plan and GP review post 1 November? And at this stage, I don't think anyone knows. And I suspect you'll find out possibly on the 30th of October. So just before the change is made, or when we get the next fee schedule from Medicare. So the challenge is how do you prepare and think about your chronic disease care moving forward? How do you look at that in preparation? And I've done a little bit of homework for you, and I want to give you some thoughts about this as well. So let's have a look at this chart. If we look at the chronic disease care plan currently, so 721 and 723, collectively together, the rebate is $294.60. Now, from that rebate, if a practice takes a service fee of 35%, the practice is receiving $103. Let's say the nurse cost for the nurse is involved in helping with that care plan is 45 minutes with the nurse, and then the doctor signs off on the care plan. So the nurse cost in there, we've attributed $45 based on an hourly rate of $60 an hour. So $45, the net revenue then to the practice from doing the chronic disease care plan is $58. If we go back to the Cubico data that I mentioned before, the average fee is $97. So the average income for the practice per consultation is $34. So we can see that if we look at a net gain or net loss, the care planning activity is actually adding value to the practice's average income, and so that to $24. All right. So this is a broad brushstroke way of looking at it, but it gives you an idea of the value of the current care planning process to the income that's generated by the practice. If after the 1st of November, you're only able to claim a GP management plan, and the GP management plan stays at the current value, then the income to the practice is going to be $58. The nurse cost is still the same at $45, and the net revenue is only going to be $13. So if we compare that to the average net revenue for the practice out of all of its services, there's going to be about a $21 loss. So a lot of practices are going to look at this and think, oh, it's just not worthwhile having nurses involved with care planning. What are we going to do? How are we going to make this work? Now, I'm a huge advocate for practice nurses and the role that they've got in the practice. So I want to say that from the outset. I think there's a way that we can reorientate this to enable nurses to work to their top of scope, but also to actually make it work from a financial point of view. So let's have a look at the next slide here, hopefully. So this slide just shows you on the left-hand side the current model. And what happens currently is with the CDM patients, all patients are eligible. So there's no prioritization. If somebody has a chronic disease, they're eligible for a care plan. And often what happens is that you might have a patient, let's think about Betty, who's highly complex, a lot of needs and everything, and she comes in, has 45 minutes with the nurse and then time with the doctor for her care plan. That is highly important for Betty, and a really important process to work through her complex care needs. But what if you have John, who's also got diabetes, but he's pretty well self-managing, and all he's come to the doctor for is he wants to have 5 subsidized appointments, Medicare appointments to the podiatrist, and where the practice is investing 45 minutes of a nurse time plus the doctor's time to essentially create a referral for the podiatrist. That is not good use of time. It doesn't enable nurses to work to their top of scope. And so there should be another way of doing that. But our systems in most practices don't actually distinguish with the care needs of the patient. We just treat every patient as long as they've got a chronic disease in the same way. The other reality is that most practices are doing 721, 723, so the initial care plans, and very few are doing the reviews. Health assessments are also only 2.5% of patient fees, and we're underutilising health assessment opportunities. And with health assessments, we know that the time that the nurse spends with the patient, we can include in the billing item. So we can adjust the billing item to take into account the time the nurse spends. So the model, I think, that just putting out to you for potentially looking at post 1 November is thinking about more of a priority care model where those high needs patients like Betty get a bundle of care, which includes a nurse helping out with their care plan, includes having their assessment, includes having their medication reviews, and you bundle all of that up together, and the revenue that comes through, you can easily justify the time of the nurse being involved with that patient's care. And then when that patient has their regular reviews, most likely the nurse could be involved with that because of the complex needs and making sure that you've got all the information you need to help support that patient. Then below that, I've got the GP only GP management plans and reviews, and I think practices are going to move to GPs doing more of their own GP management plans and reviews. And in this model, what I would be suggesting is that the GPs do that for some of their less needy, less complex patients, and really work through using those item numbers to create the care plans and to create access to allied health services through the EPC referrals, etc., for those patients. And the other thing that I've highlighted in this model is that those high need patients that are in that priority care model area, in future, they've already flagged this, that in future there are going to be more Medicare bundled payments that are focused on patients with priority needs to help support them with their care. And a lot of it is going to be focused on keeping patients out of hospital. So how do we work out which patients we're going to focus on? Well, this is a starting point. So I'm not sure if any of you access PenCat data. Most practices in rural South Australia have access to PenCat. And through this data, there is a metric in there that is created by the CSIRO about risk of hospitalisation. And you can go in and identify your patients who are most at risk of hospitalisation. And in this example here for this practice, 8% of their patients in that group have a risk that's greater than 20% of the average population of going into hospital. So if we looked at that 8% group, the ones that I've highlighted in there, I think this is a really easy way and an appropriate way to actually identify the high need patients who are likely to look at needing your priority care with the nurse involvement and the full package, compared to those patients who are going to probably be independently managed by the GP. So the model there is really focusing on top of scope for your nurses, getting them to focus on the high needs patients, but doing more health assessments as well as part of that, and providing more focused care on the patients that most need it. So I'm going to have a breath there and see whether we've got any questions around some of those financial some of those financial areas.
No questions as of yet. We are still definitely open for questions. If anybody wants to send questions through the chat function or the Q&A box.
I'm interested, even if anybody, this is just my ideas working through through how this could potentially work. You might have had some other plans or some other thoughts about what you might do in your practice, and if you're willing to share those, that'd be interesting to hear as well. Oh, okay. All right. I'll leave that with you. Hopefully, I haven't baffled you too much with numbers, but what I really wanted to do was to make the clear point that it's important, if you want to run a successful practice, to plan for some financial success, to know your key numbers, and also when there's a big change ahead, like the change to the chronic disease management, is to think about a strategy to reorientate, so that you can deliver the best care to your patients, but also to get the best value for the services that you deliver as well. Cool. Okay. Now we're going to go on to my next favorite topic: supportive collaborative environments. So I was doing some work with Health Recruitment Plus down in Tasmania, and we were looking at a program to help support practices in terms of their recruitment and retention of GPs. And one of the things that really came strongly out of that work was that while we can't control the GP numbers that are available and the challenges that you face in rural areas around recruitment, one of the differentiating factors for practices that were successful with recruitment and especially retention of their GPs was that they had what we would call highly positive workplace cultures. So workplace culture is really crucial for your practice in terms of, one is its attractiveness, its brand, its understanding in the market, especially in rural South Australia where a lot of people know each other. What is the reputation your practice has for its culture? And also really important for retention. And people are more likely to stay, they're more likely to stick if they feel really connected to the culture that in your practice. So I'm going to work through some of these key elements that actually underpin culture, so that we can talk through those. The first part I wanted to highlight is about strategy and purpose, and I've already talked a little bit about the importance of strategy for your team in terms of performance. But one of the main issues around strategy is that people like to work in a business and in a practice where there's a sense of purpose. And we know that with the next generation, they are actually, more than anything else, they are looking for work opportunities where there's a sense of purpose in their work. So being clear about your strategy and your purpose as a practice is really important. And what this chart called the agreements matrix shows, this comes out of a Harvard Business Review article read several years ago, and it sort of stuck with me because I think it works really well. What it shows is that on the left-hand side there, the axis there is where are we going, and if the practice has a broad consensus and clarity about its strategy, it's higher on that chart on the left-hand side. On the other axis, I think that's the x-axis, how do we get there? If practices have really good systems in place, really good management structures in place for how do we do things here, that they will be higher on that axis than at the left-hand side of that axis. So what we see here, and I see this in a lot of smaller rural practices, is that there isn't a strategy, but there's also a high dependence on the solo principal for decision making in every facet. And in those businesses, we see that they're power dependent. They're really dependent on the authority and power of that one individual. And so that sort of structure doesn't really promote and empower your team to work to their top of game and to actually thrive in their work. If we have a practice that is really clear about where they're going, they've got strong leadership, dynamic, charismatic, charging from the front sort of leaders, but no real good systems in place. Those practices are leadership dependent. So they thrive on the leadership, but when things turn a bit sour, they start to grumble and grizzle because things are messy and difficult to get organized. On the flip side, if practices have really good structures in place, but there's no strategy, they are essentially management dependent. They do things because they're told to do things, and they're basically working by rote, so that they do as they're instructed, but without any passion or purpose about it. So the ultimate outcome for any team environment is to be culture dependent and to have a culture where we're clear about where we're going, where our sense of purpose is as a business, but also we've got good systems and structures in place that support us to do our jobs. And so that's utopia in terms of team effectiveness. So I'll leave that chart with you to think about in terms of where does your practice sit and what's the dynamic of your practice, and really be honest with yourself in terms of that, and then work through, okay, which part of this do you really need to concentrate on to improve your practice to get to a point where it's more culture dependent. The next part is about values driven, and I talk to practices a lot about their core values and do they have their values. And to be honest, there's a lot of principals, partners, etc., that might roll their eyes and think, well, we just want to be doctors. We're just going to take care of our patients. What more do we need to know? What's all this values guff? But the reality is that the practices that have actually drilled down on their core values and leveraged those core values are able to create a much better, stronger culture within their business. Because what we see in this diagram shows is that values are able to, and if you drive your values, you're able to actually address behaviors. And if you collectively improve the behaviors within your practice, you end up collectively improving the culture. And in the absence of values, there is no guiding rod, there is no guidance that actually helps to manage and work through with behaviors. And as an aside, when you're a practice manager trying to manage poor performance or attitude issues, it's the behaviors you actually have to manage. And those behaviors, you can only leverage your values to actually hold people account about whether they're displaying the values of your practice as a way of actually managing those attitudes. So values drive behaviors. Behaviors collectively create culture in your practice. So have you got clear values in your business? Are you, as the owners of your business, the managers of your business, living and breathing and modeling those values? Sometimes we see values are nice words on the wall, but the owners and the managers are actually not modeling them, and the staff can see right through that. So where are you at with your practice in terms of creating the culture that you want to create in your practice? One of my other pet topics is around feedback. And what we see in a lot of businesses, and it's not just general practices, is that the only time some of your staff get attention is when they've done something wrong. They'll get feedback, they'll get maybe tapped on the shoulder. Why did you do this? What was happening there? We often spend extraordinary amount of time on poor performers and trying to manage poor performance. But how often do we actually provide regular and helpful feedback to our staff that are performing well? And this performance model that I've got here can be used in a positive sense in terms of acknowledging great performance, but it can also be used in a sense of constructive sense of acknowledging poor performance or poor behavior as well. But I would encourage you to think about, at least in your practice, how often are you acknowledging and getting alongside your staff just to tap them on the shoulder and say to you, hey, can I give you some feedback? When you smiled at that patient and engaged them in that way, that has made their day. That helps us to have a really, really good reputation in this community. And I love to see you providing that same sort of attitude and care to every patient that walks in this door. Now, how effective is that as a business owner if you're giving that feedback? Just on the side, I've noticed you doing something extraordinary. I want to acknowledge it. This feedback model is really important because what it does is to say, I'm going to give you some feedback. You describe the behaviors, you talk about the consequences of the behavior, and then you describe the outcome that you want. So it's not just praise. It's not, oh, good job. Good job doesn't mean anything to anybody. This is about giving feedback. So when I say to catch up with one of the team and say, hey, can I give you some feedback? When you come into work late all the time, it's really annoying your fellow receptionists and everything, and I don't think you want them annoyed with you. So can we just make sure you're here on time? And then we walk away and leave it as that. That's the feedback. So it can be used in a positive sense. It can be used to address concerning behavior as well. But I would encourage you, if addressing concerning behavior is difficult for you, at least smother your team with positive feedback and acknowledge the wonderful things that they're doing. The other thing I wanted to talk about here with creating a positive workplace culture is understanding the root cause. And this chart just gives you an idea that often when we're trying to deal with issues with staff, we might have some friction between the nurses and the reception staff. You might have a particular relationship that is not constructive in your practice, and everyone's walking around on eggshells trying to avoid the consequences of it. What we don't often do is look down at the layers below that and identify what the root cause of that problem is. And so often when we look at practices and issues that they're trying to deal with at the relationship level, the root cause is actually more about people not understanding what the practice is trying to achieve in terms of their vision and goals. Very often it's about confusion about their roles. They've been put into a new job, but no one's really clearly defined it. No one's given them account of their delegations of what decisions they can make or what decisions they can't make. Or there's really messiness around structures. So we've got people just working across areas with no clear structures in how we do things. And also that there haven't been processes put into place. So you might have a new initiative in your practice, a new model of care, but people actually haven't really spelt out and documented and made sure your whole team understands the processes that are in place. And all of that collectively just creates a potential for angst, frustration, anger, and problems within the relationships within your team. So my encouragement through this is around understanding or trying to tap into what is the root cause of issues that are in your practice, and not necessarily just to look at it from the individual relationship point of view. All right, so I'll take a breath there. There are some of the highlights packages from me around positive workplace culture. What is it that you can do in your practice to help elevate the culture of your practice? Because it takes work, it takes a lot of time. It's about connecting your team socially. It's about making sure that people are able to work to their top of game. So any questions?
No questions as of yet, Danny.
No?
We'll anticipate.
Oh, that's good. You all want to get home early or finish up
That,
early.
that's
Um,
what it seems. Everybody just wants to finish up early.
I was anticipating some debate or discussion, challenges. But any questions or thoughts around that? Is there anything that you do in your practice to improve the culture? Oh, okay. We're all quiet today. Um, all right. Let's move on then to the last part, number 4, succession. Succession is one of the biggest issues we see for medical practices. It's an issue that has arisen not just with GP practices, but we work across specialist, allied health, dental, etc. And quite often we get to a point where, or have a situation where a principal's decided that they're going to leave. They might give 3 months notice and tell everyone else they're out of there, and the rest of the practice is left scrambling, trying to react, survive, and manage. I did hear about one practice where out of their 5 ownership group members, they had 3 just leave within a 6-month period all at once, and pretty well decimated that ownership group for a while. For the smaller rural practices, it's a crucial issue thinking about, well, if you're the only doctor, you're the only principal, who's going to take on that practice after I leave? Who's going to come on board? And you don't always, I understand, have the luxury of selection. It's often just difficult enough to get a doctor to come and work in your practice. But what I wanted to work through today is to some of the key learnings that we've had from working with practices around succession and the things to think about as you're working towards succession. The first one is around tenure mapping. And this is a concept that's quite was not familiar to a lot of people. And it's something that we do regularly with our practices when we do our strategic planning, because we first need to understand the future prospects of who out of the ownership group are still going to be there in 5 years before we really start to nail down what are the strategies for the next 5 years. And through Brentnall's, this is one of the things that internally as an organisation we have done systematically. Every year when we meet for our planning retreat, we have up on the board a similar tenure mapping exercise to the one that you see there, where everyone in the ownership group has openly said, this is when I think I'm going to be looking to exit from the business, retire from the business. I might not be retiring from medicine, or I might not be retiring from the work that I do, but this is when I'm going to plan to exit from the ownership group of the business. And so this example that you've got on your screen there is a practice that recently did a strategy session with, and they hadn't had these discussions. And in fact, one of those people, I think I've named him Sven. Sven piped up as we went around the table to ask everyone when they were planning to exit. He piped up and said, well, I'm planning to be gone in 6 months. And no one else in that group knew that that was his plan. And so everyone's been scurrying around since, trying to work out how they were going to manage that transition. So you can see with this practice, one of the things that this exercise identified was that in 5 years' time they had a cliff. That by 5 years' time, if they didn't regenerate their ownership group, they were going to be down to a much smaller number. Now, if you're a small practice, 1 or 2 principals, you'd love to have still 5 principals there, but we're talking about the scale of some of these practices, that if they don't regenerate and get on board the next generation, ultimately you get to a point where somebody's left holding the baby, the last one or two standing, holding a practice that they're going to struggle to vacate when the time's ready for them. So this is a really helpful exercise. It would be interesting to know whether you've done that at all with your practice, and whether your principals have had those discussions about when they're planning to exit, so that you can actually map out, well, okay, what's our plan, especially for getting on the next generation. Who's the next doctor in your group that you want to invite to come into ownership with you? And what sort of time frame are you looking at to try and get them on board? But then it begs the question, should you go into business with anybody? And the answer to that is no. We should be very careful about going into business with people, and the only relationship more important than a business relationship is a marital relationship. Business relationships, often people jump into business together, and sooner or later things go pear-shaped, and then we have all manner of problems to deal with. So business relationships are very precious and should be seen in that regard. And one of the things we encourage practices to do is to do the work beforehand, before having somebody in mind, and look at some selection criteria. On what basis will they be happy to bring somebody on board to their ownership group? And here's some ideas. This is what one of the checklists from one of the practices I worked with. The most important part: do they share our values? If you bring somebody into your ownership group that doesn't have the same value base as you, the same core principles and values, that relationship won't last long. It will be at loggerheads, and you'll have problems persistently. So the key area that we've seen it day in, day out with practices is if they bring on partners that and owners together that share values, then it's usually a much longer lasting relationship than when those values are at odds. It is the most important characteristic that you need to think about in terms of selection. You're better off not bringing somebody on board who doesn't have the shared values with you. Other areas, obviously, thinking about their revenue performance. What are they contributing to the practice? What other contributions are they making other than revenue? So in some rural practices where you have proceduralists and non-proceduralists, how does that work? And some you might have some non-proceduralists who may not be able to bill some of the higher billing than a proceduralist does, but they're seeing a lot of the mental health patients and doing other work that the proceduralist may not be interested in doing. So what is the contribution to the business overall? What are their relationships like with your staff? If you're bringing on somebody into your ownership group who doesn't have good relationships with your staff, that's not going to be a good outcome. What is there a minimum number of sessions that they need to work for your practice? And are there any specific skill sets or interests that you're wanting to bring on board? Do you need to get somebody on board with procedural skills, or do you want to get somebody on board with some particular skills around mental health or some other area? So having a checklist, having predetermined some criteria in your own mind, putting that down on paper, and when you think about a candidate, can you tick all those boxes to determine whether or not they're a good fit for coming on board as an owner in your practice? The other thing that really is important to do, especially when you've got a change, is to think about your business structure. A business structure that might have been set up 20, 30 years ago may not necessarily be the best business structure for you moving forward. And we do a lot of work with practices around this issue at the time when they've got a change in ownership, is to think about their business structure. And one of the key areas that we look at is this calculation of what is the net profit as a percentage of revenue for the principals. So if you look at this example that I've pulled together, what it shows you is the fees for each of the principals. Then once they pay their percentage, how much the principal's retaining. So this is based on a 65-35% split. So let's see, Doctor Who generates $450,000 worth of fees. Doctor Who then retains 292,500. The business makes a profit overall of 400,000, of which he's getting an equal share at 100,000. So Doctor Who's net profit is 392,500. So that net profit figure as a percentage of the fees that Doctor Who generates is 87.2%. Okay, that's a reasonable return. If he was an independent practitioner, it might be a 65-35% split. It shows some value of being an owner. And so that value is there for all of these owners. But if we look at Dr. Wellbeing, Dr. Wellbeing is generating the least amount of revenue into the business, retains her 65%, plus has business profit of 100,000. And you can see that Dr. Wellbeing is essentially retaining 108.5% of their revenue. And you can see that disparity across the other owners there. And one of the things this is one of the key issues that comes up with practices is that where there's this disparity is a concern about fairness. Now, fairness is what you sign up for in your agreements and what you've all agreed to knowing when you go into the business. But there are times that it is worthwhile reviewing the structure of your practice and seeing whether or not it is delivering a fair outcome for the owners, depending on their contribution to the practice. Some practices have the view that if you buy into the practice, you deserve and pay your fair share. What you generate in terms of fees and that professionally and personally is your own concern, but you deserve to get an equal share of the profit. And there's nothing wrong with that mindset. Other practices, other principals will look at these figures and say that doesn't stack up. The person who's actually doing the most work for that practice is getting the least return on their effort. And so we need to adjust that. So there's ways to deal with that. The main question I've got here for you is when there's a change in ownership, it's a really good time to think about your structure. Have you got the right structure in place before you get the new person on board? Agreements.
Danny, we
Yes.
just had a question, a while ago. What is your thoughts on staff catch-ups?
In terms of regular staff catch-ups, is that the question?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. So it is good. It's an important part. I almost put some information in there about performance management. And one of the things these days that performance management has moved away from a focus on just an annual performance review to more regular staff check-ins. And we see that practices and businesses, some of them retain their annual process, but then augment that with regular check-ins with their staff, often taking them out for a coffee catch-up in a neutral environment over coffee. It's a bit casual and just connecting with your team. And that is the more contemporary approach now to actually managing and keeping on side with your team. And what that does is to actually help you identify problems before they become bigger problems, to nip issues in the bud, because you're connecting with that relationship. But sometimes that coffee catch up can identify there's a brewing issue that you weren't aware about that you could actually deal with and manage proactively. So yes, I'm a big fan of coffee catch ups, annual performance reviews without any sort of catch up or interaction outside of that process is pretty much a waste of time, because all you're doing is once a year taking stock, making people anxious about where performance is at. You're not actually helping and supporting them to work to top of game throughout the year. Does that answer that question for you?
Perfect. Thank you, Danny.
Great. All right. Thanks for asking that question. I'm happy to go back over some other ground if at any time as well. So we've got time to deal with that. In terms of succession, the other thing that we think is really important is that is about the agreements. And I've got the statement up there that agreements are only required when there's a disagreement. We see that as when there's disagreements, all of a sudden, all the owners start diving for the filing cabinets to find the agreements to work out whether or not they're right or wrong. And it's important, though, we've found historically practices haven't had the right agreements in place, and they haven't covered all aspects of their practice in terms of how they operate. So this diagram shows you the practitioner, that there needs to be agreements between the practitioner and the practice as the administrative and services. If the practitioners are a part of an ownership group, there needs to be a partnership group agreement or an agreement between them as unit holders, which is often part of the administrative and services, but an agreement between the ownership group is important. And then when there's property involved, if it's an external landlord, there needs to be an agreement between the practices service trust and that landlord is usually a formal lease agreement. What we often find that's missing in place is when the practice owners are also own the property, there isn't a lease arrangement or any type of agreement between the practice and the practice property. So just thinking about your business and do you have the agreements in place that you need to? Are they adequate? And again, if you do have a change in ownership, it's a really good time to pull out your partnership agreement. For the new owner coming in needs to have the ability to look at that ownership agreement, the partnership agreement. And it's a good time to appraise whether there's anything that needs to be updated in that agreement. The agreement that you had 20 years ago is probably not going to stack up for you now in 2024. So it's a great time to refresh on that. The other part that we often get contacted from practices about is practice valuations. When you're looking at succession and somebody wants to buy in, what's the practice worth? Now, I know that in rural areas, sometimes you're just happy to get somebody on board and there's no price paid for entry into a practice. And there's nothing wrong with that, because we've even seen that with a recent practice I worked with where the practice would have been valued at, I reckon the whole practice would have been valued about $3 million. They had the same thing, that people basically came on board. There was no significant payment paid to enter in that practice, but at the same time, when partners exited, there was no significant payment on the other end. But we'll find these days that most practices, if there's the ability to appraise and determine goodwill value, that there is a value of that practice, that there is an entry cost for new partners to come into that practice. And if a doctor's exiting, then they get paid an exit value for the work and the way that they've built up that practice over time. So the key questions are there. So what's the methodology? And there are a variety of different ways in which practices can be valued. We would encourage you to get an independent valuation done. Yes, it's going to cost some money, but it's important for the people involved with that transaction, especially if it's quite an expensive one, to have certainty that the value that they are paying each way is appropriate. Is there a goodwill payment, or is it really just about paying for the value of the assets and equipment of the practice? So it's important to understand what are you paying for if somebody is coming on board to your practice, or if you're looking to exit, what are you expecting that person who's going to buy your practice to pay for? And the last point I'm making there is not to ignore director loan accounts where you have several owners, any more than one, where you have several owners, they're often over time they're built up with director loan accounts, which means that there's money in the business that is owed to the directors. And so when a director or when an owner exits and leaves, the business actually has to pay them out the money that's on those loan accounts. And sometimes those loan accounts we've seen have built up to quite a substantial figure. So it's one thing about the goodwill value that the person has to pay to buy into the practice, but they may also have to pay in money to pay out the loan accounts of the exiting party. So if you're thinking about succession and that, being clear about what is the expectation of the transaction, what is the expectation of value of that practice, is the methodology right, and have you covered all of the elements of that transaction that need to be covered, including director loan accounts. And the last point I want to make around succession is to map the process out. One of the really successful practices that I work with, what they did was to create an action plan. So as they were going through a process of succession, bringing on board a new owner and one of the older owners retiring, they kept a log of all the steps that they worked with, converted that into an action plan, and over the next 5 years they actually had 4 of those transactions to work through, and so they had a process map that they were able to work through each of the steps involved with managing that transition in and out. And so that's a very helpful thing to do. So if you do manage a succession and it's the first time you don't know what the steps are, get some information from your advisors, your accountant and lawyers in terms of the things that need to be done. Work through that process and keep a record of that process, convert that into an action plan, and then you've got that for any future entries and exit out of your business. So there we have it. There's succession in a nutshell. So yeah, we've got plenty of time for any questions here from you. It can be questions about any of the topics we've covered tonight, or just specifically about succession.
I'll keep an eye on the Q&A box and also the chat function, so feel free to ask questions if you had any.
While we're waiting for any questions, just that QR reader there, I believe that is registering for our newsletter through Brentnall's. It is a newsletter. It's good information that's provided. It's once a quarter. We don't spam people with lots of information that's useless and extraordinary marketing. It's a newsletter. It's for your information. You're welcome to sign up. You don't have to be a Brentnall's client for it. My email address is there. If you want access to any resources that we've talked about, please contact me. Briefing papers, etc. You're more than welcome to follow that up, and I'm happy to share some of that with you. And also in terms of the slides, we can share those out through to you. So it's possibly you've got everyone's email address, haven't you?
Yes, I do.
So
yeah.
what we might do is convert that into a PDF, and then we can send that out to you in a PDF format.
Perfect. We have a question that's come through. The question is, thoughts around having a minimum time working in practice before buying in?
Oh yeah, great question. I would say you really would ideally you'd want a year, at least 6 months before before buying in, and I think that works for both parties. Part of the issue about buying in is that until you really work through that cycle and spend some good time in the practice, it's hard to know whether it fits for you. And vice versa for somebody, if if you've got somebody who's working with you with a view to joining the practice, you really need at least 6 months to see how they're performing, how they work with your team, how the relationships are building, and whether they've got the capacity and the values that you're looking for. Any other questions? I think that the other thing that we see, especially in rural areas, is that practice ownership is potentially one of those anchoring opportunities as well. That for practices, if you can offer the opportunity of ownership, then it's a way of getting more commitment from people to stay. And so that's a good strategy, but I think the only thing I would say is just be wary of making sure that you've got the values matching up, because like I said, that can be problematic moving forward. The other thing is that sometimes we look at the ownership model being about just the practice or the property separate, or it all bundled up together. And sometimes if you've got property as an option versus the practice, you could actually look at ownership of either or. So there's different ways to actually look at that from a point of view of potentially trying to anchor and get commitment from people to stay and work at your practice.
Perfect. Any last questions before we finish off? Well, while we wait for more questions to trickle in, statements of attendance will be sent out next week, and also resources and of Danny's slides will also be sent out with that. Apart from this, if you have any more questions, then feel free to either send it to Danny or myself, and I'll forward on to Danny if there are any questions. And yeah. Did you have anything else to talk about tonight, Danny, or was that all for tonight as well?
Oh no, there's plenty to talk about. But I know that the time is running late. And but yeah, I guess also happy if anyone has any particular payroll tax questions, because we've been up to here with payroll tax issues for the last 2-3 years, and so I'm happy to field any questions around that if anyone particularly does. I think one of the important things for rural practices to appreciate is that the recent government concession around payroll tax, while it wasn't the outcome that we would have really liked to have seen, one of the things that's really important for rural practices that are under agreements with their local LHN for providing services into the hospital is that those payments from the hospital through to the practice, and then on pay those payments through to your practitioners, those payments are recognised as being exempt from payroll tax. It was a huge win for rural practices to have that revenue excluded from any payroll tax liability. It just didn't make sense that on one hand the government was paying for those services, and on the other hand the government was going to taking a tax from practices for the privilege of it. So one of the things that it's worthwhile keeping an eye on is, what does that mean for your practice in terms of looking ahead with your payroll tax liability, and have you calculated what that would mean in terms of reducing your payroll tax liability?
Another question as well that's came up. Interested further in the discussion around the business owning the property?
Okay, yeah. So in some respects, the issue, one of the things we like to do with businesses is for businesses that can run their businesses and own their businesses, but also then own the property in which they operate from. Owning the property, it gives you another business for you to create equity and gradually build up your wealth as an owner. It also provides some advantages from a tax point of view, because as that property business generates a profit, then that profit is usually business profit and not your personal income profit. So you can manage that profit in a more tax in tax beneficial way. Now, remember my disclaimer: seek your advice from your own accountant and advisors around that. But the principle is there that if you own your own property, you can generate, I guess, another avenue of wealth and profit that you don't have if you are then paying your rent to a landlord, which is essentially dead money for you. Now, the difficulty with this is that often we find that with some practices where they own the property and they're cheap in terms of not paying their own property entity enough rent. And so what that can do is, if the practice is up for looking at selling, it can actually inflate the value of the practice because you're not paying a market rate for the rent. So that's one of the things that we would always advise practice business owners to do, is that if they have a property entity, to ensure that they're paying a market rate across to that property entity, even if the owners are in common. It makes sense to do that. There are some practices that we've worked with where the property might have one or two of the principals involved with it, but they may have a couple other third parties involved. And that's where the amount of rent paid and everything really needs to make sure that that's all on commercial terms. So there are quite a lot of different arrangements, but yes, if you can actually own your property and use that to generate wealth and also some profit out of that, then it's often a good idea to consider. Any other questions? I'm happy to field that. Did that question answer what you were wanting to get from that question, or did you want me to be a bit more specific about anything else?
It's James here, the one that was trying to type but too slow. Just
Hi,
saying,
James.
thank you for that. No, you have covered it there. The downside of it, I see, is that if the business owns it, there becomes a substantial buy-in to the business, which may be a bit prohibitive to new people joining. Now, I'm speaking as somebody in a single ownership country practice that historically has had minimal buy-in, or virtually none. And suddenly, if the practice itself owns the building, the buy-in becomes huge. But otherwise, it seems quite a logical thing to do. Over.
Yeah, that's a good point, James. And I think a couple of things I would say to that is that one of the advantages you have as medical practitioners is that the banks are willing to loan 100% of goodwill in terms of the value of buying into a business, and pretty well loan 100% of the value of a property. So they've tightened up a little bit more recently, but in some respects, because of the advantages that medical practitioners have, the actual hurdle around that investment is more about the person getting their head around the level of debt and being comfortable with that. And as long as the business is thriving and robust enough, then that shouldn't be too big a hurdle. Now, if it is, the other thing that some practices basically have the practice entity and the property entity intrinsically linked, so that if you want to buy into that practice and become an owner of that practice, you have to buy into both the practice and the property. And they've had that hardwired for years. We've worked with practices over time just to help them actually separate those entities out, so that they may have somebody come on board that only wants to buy into the practice entity first up, and then down the track, once they're comfortable with where they're at, and they might have paid off some of their debt for buying into the practice, etc., then they can buy into the property entity. So it doesn't have to be all or nothing, but it can be managed in different ways.
Questions? Accountants/advisors, what are the things we should look at when looking at changing?
Yes, good question. So, a couple of things that I would say is that accounting and financial advisor relationships are pretty precious. So we understand that, and so it's important, if you've got a trusted relationship and that, to hold on to that relationship. But if you're not feeling like you're getting the service that you need when you're looking around, I would suggest that as medical professionals that you look for an accounting firm that has commitment, specialization, and interest in the health sector. They understand the issues that are related to you, and aside from Brentnells, there are other firms that do that as well. So it's not about just promoting us. Yes, that's our vested interest, but aside from that, look at the firms that actually have legitimate specializations or interest in working with medical practitioners. The other thing about financial planning and that is that, and I don't really know this until I started really working for an accounting firm and seeing how this worked, but a lot of accounting firms will have a financial planning arm. And so when you go to that new accountant, you'll also essentially be adopted by their financial planners, and everything goes over through there. The issue there is the question of independence, we feel, and our approach at Brentnells is that we have relationships with a variety of different financial planners who we know and trust in the industry, but we don't have financial planning in-house, because we feel like the relationship between our clients and the accountant needs to be independent from the relationship with the financial planner. Now, that's our view, and it's not necessarily the view held by all the accountants, but it's something for you to consider, is that when you're looking, if you're looking for a financial advisor and accounting relationship, if it's all bundled up into the one firm, I would just be questioning about how they can assure you that you're getting totally independent advice.
Perfect. And next question is, what about if someone wants to leave the practice but does not want to sell their property share?
Yeah, that will depend on the structure that you've got in place, and a lot of it depends on, again, the agreements. When somebody leaves, what do the agreements say about their obligations to sell? And so if the practice has that the property ownership is part of owning the practice, then if they want to leave the practice, then because they're intrinsically linked, they'll also need to leave the property ownership group. We've had some situations with practices where they're not intrinsically linked, so the principals have left the practice but still retain ownership of the property. one in particular in Victoria we're working with, where the property was essentially there was only one of the remaining partners who owned the property, and the other three partners had all exited the practice, had retired, but were still retaining ownership of the property. And in that situation, that arrangement was handcuffing the business, because they wanted to get the property developed and do some other things with the property, but the three retiring parties weren't willing to do that at their age. They weren't interested in it. They were just more interested in the money going into their self-managed super fund. So it is important to think about the arrangements that are in place if your property entity is separated from the practice entity. What are the clauses around exit and the requirements for somebody to exit if they actually leave the practice? You could have a requirement within the agreement that if they leave the community in which you're living in, that they have to exit the ownership group, or you could have a clause in there that the remaining parties have a right to force an exit at any point in time. There are many different ways in which your legal advisors could advise you about how to put in triggers that would make sure that if there was somebody holding on and it was holding back the practice, that there would be ways for that party to be encouraged to exit.
Perfect. And I think that was all in terms of questions. We had none come through. But
Right.
yeah.
Well, thank you for that. Thanks for bearing with me. It was a lot to cover tonight, but I really wanted to give you some of the high-level key things that we're conscious about that help practices thrive and survive in the current environment. And also, I really appreciate some of the questions that you've asked. We didn't have a lot of questions, but the ones that we had were great, and it's really good to hear those, and hopefully we've been able to answer those so that you can move forward with your practices and get them humming as much as you possibly can.
Thank you, Danny, for a very informative presentation tonight. And I'd like to formally close off the webinar. And if there are any questions, please feel free to email the Satnia team. And apart from that, then have a lovely night. And thank you again, Danny. And I'd also like to thank Country PHN for funding this webinar for us as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.